Are you feeling gooped, gagged, and agog at the number of new cultures you're experiencing at college? Do you feel like closing yourself off, or are you just trying to fit in? Maybe it all feels like an entirely new planet. Well, your experiences can't be explained by aliens, but it can be explained by the co-cultural theory.
Co-culture theory is a theory that states that society has a dominant cultural group, and any group outside of that dominant cultural group is a marginalized group. Marginalized groups outside of dominant culture are known as co-cultures. There are three ways that co-cultures exist in society. One, via assimilation, when the marginalized group tries to blend in with the dominant culture. Two, accommodation, when the group works to bring changes within the dominant culture so that they, the marginalized group, can be included. And three, separation, when the group focuses more on being in community with each other apart from the dominant culture. This is co-cultural theory, and it's very relevant to college campuses due to the fact that there are so many co-cultures on a college campus, and that's why we chose to focus on it for this presentation.
According to M. Griffin, Andrew Ledbetter, and Glenn Sparks, co-authors of the 10th edition of the book A First Look at Communications Theory, published in 2019, assimilation is when members of a co-culture try to fit in with the dominant culture, often by working to look and act more like them. In a study done by Stanford AA and several other authors in 2019 and published by Communication Quarterly, they found that most of the Hispanic students in the southwestern U.S. school they studied used assimilation strategies when they were around white students. Even though the Hispanics were technically the majority of the school itself, they were still the co-culture of the larger society and felt the same pressures described in the co-culture theory. They did things like emphasize the things that they had in common with the whites and avoid talking about racism at all. They also felt that they had to work a lot harder than the whites to prove themselves, and they worked to drop accents and avoid certain styles of clothing so that they could fit in better. All of these are behaviors that are associated with the assimilation strategy.
M. Griffin, Andrew Ledbetter, and Glenn Sparks, authors of the book A First Look at Communication Theory, define accommodation as the co-cultural process of working to change dominant cultural rules to take the life experiences of co-cultural members into account. Here, we are going to see examples of how some physically disabled people accommodate in a work setting. According to Marsha Cohen and Susan Anfanzino, researchers of the article Framing Organizational Assimilation Experiences of Physically Disabled People Using Co-Cultural Theory state that Barbara, a research participant, uses confrontational action to demand that her disability be taken into consideration in her workplace so she can work 32 hours of full benefits instead of 40. Researchers also state that Carol, a research participant, also demands fair treatment by making herself visible in her workplace. She also dispels stereotypes by helping co-workers in times of need. This act goes against the stereotype that disabled people are the ones who always need help. It also gets her co-workers to accommodate her needs and treat her fairly in her workplace.
Co-cultural separation can be defined as a member or members of a co-cultural group actively trying to maintain a space outside of the dominant culture. As you can see from the slide, the real-life example for this is queer culture, but you can also see examples of separation in First Nation spaces, African and Mexican American spaces, and so on. According to their 2012 article published in the Howard Journal of Communications, California State University Northridge associates Kamara, Hildebrandt Sterling, Katznelson, and Parker found that the most common form of separation among queer people was just avoiding spaces and situations that included majority dominant culture. More assertive forms of this, however, can look like the creation of spaces particularly for that group, positively highlighting that group's accomplishments, or separating yourself by negatively critiquing the dominant group. As mentioned before, accommodation is defined by Griffin, Ledbetter, and Sparks as when members of a co-culture work to change the rules of the dominant culture to have their experiences taken into account. An example of this can be found in the popular animated TV series Avatar The Last Airbender. In episode 18, the heroes have finally reached the North Pole where Aang and Katara can learn waterbending so they can defend themselves as they travel and ultimately defeat the show's antagonist. The waterbending teacher, however, refuses to teach Katara because she's a girl, and they aren't allowed to use their skills to fight. Ultimately, Katara uses aggressive accommodation to challenge the unfair rules, and even goes so far as to challenge the waterbending master himself to a fight one-on-one. She quite literally fights the dominant culture to accommodate her experiences and needs.